Some nightmares do not end when you wake up. They follow you into the bathroom mirror, into the taste of your morning coffee, into the way your hands tremble when you try to button a shirt. They start leaving evidence, not metaphorical evidence, physical proof that something happened while you were unconscious, proof that your mind did not merely imagine the dark, but visited it. My name is Jack, and I spent most of my life trying to convince myself that sleep was harmless. I learned otherwise the night I was 18, the night I saw something that split my future into two separate timelines. One where I became an adult and tried to build a normal life, and another where I never really left that moment at all. At first, I believed the nightmares were punishment, a kind of moral infection that grew in the soft parts of the brain. Later, I understood they were a door, not a symbolic door, a real one. A door that opened wider each time I closed my eyes. And at the end of everything, when I thought I had reached the final depth of my sanity, when I thought I had finally arrived at the place people went when they could no longer be kept in the world, I found out the most terrifying part was not what I saw in my sleep. The most terrifying part was how much time I had already lost. I used to think trauma arrived like thunder, loud and obvious and impossible to deny. The reality was quieter. It slipped into the body with a calmness that felt almost polite, and then it stayed there, like a splinter that never worked itself free. I was 18 when it happened, old enough to be trusted with my own car, young enough to still believe that bad things happen to other people. It was late, the kind of late where the streets were empty, but not peaceful, where every storefront looked shut like an eyelid, and every traffic light felt like it was waiting for someone who would never come. I was driving home through the back way, past a stretch of road that cut between trees and an industrial lot, when I saw the shape in the headlights. At first it looked like a pile of clothing, a collapsed shadow, a smear at the edge of the asphalt. Then it shifted, and my stomach tightened as the brain tried to name it and failed. I remember braking too hard, the tires making a sound like something tearing, the car lurching to a stop with my seatbelt biting into my collarbone. I remember the silence afterward, the ringing quiet that comes when the world holds its breath. I got out because people do that, because the human brain clings to decency even when decency is dangerous. In the headlight glow, the thing on the road resolved into a person, not moving, not arranged the way a person ever naturally lies down. Their limbs were positioned with a kind of careless force, as if they had been thrown and then forgotten. The skin on my arms went tight. The air had a scent that wasn't strong enough to identify, but strong enough to warn. Something metallic and stale, like pennies left in a wet pocket. I took a few steps closer, and then my eyes caught on details my mind refused to accept as real. A shoe half off, a sock damp and dark, a line of bruising that looked less like an impact and more like a grip. Then I saw the face. It wasn't the gore that stayed with me. It was the expression, the open mouth shape that looked like it had been frozen in the middle of a breath, and the eyes, staring upward with a blankness that made me feel watched, even though the person was clearly gone. My body reacted before my thoughts did. I stumbled backward and nearly fell, my heel catching on gravel. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get my phone out. I did not call anyone I knew. I did not call my parents. I did not call a friend. I called the number people call when they need the world to take control. After that, the memory breaks in places. I remember the taste of bile, bitter and hot. I remember my throat hurting from breathing too shallow. I remember my headlights shining on the figure as if my car was the only thing keeping the darkness from swallowing it whole. I remember that, at some point, something moved in the tree line. Not a deer, not wind. A shift in the shadows, a silhouette that stood too upright and too still. A presence that felt attentive, as if it was observing my reaction to the body. I remember the sensation of being seen by something that did not feel human. I got back in my car, slammed the door, and locked it so hard my fingers ached afterward. The silhouette in the trees did not step into the light. It remained where it was, motionless, and I sat there gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went pale. When help finally arrived, the world became bright and loud and full of adult voices moving with practiced urgency. They asked me questions. They guided me away. They told me to breathe. I answered everything like a good witness. But something inside me had already started to detach. That night, when I finally got home, my room looked unfamiliar. The corners seemed deeper, the ceiling higher, the shadows heavier. I left my light on until my eyes burned, and then I turned it off because I knew I had to sleep. I lay in bed listening to the house settle, listening to my own heartbeat thump against my ribs. My body was exhausted, but my mind had become an animal caught in a trap, thrashing at every sound. When I finally drifted under, it wasn't gradual. It was like falling through a floor. I was back on the road. Not in a dreamlike, softened version of it, in an exact replica. The same gravel, the same smear of moonlight between the trees, the same dead stillness in the air. The body was there, exactly where it had been, and my headlights were still on, and I knew, somehow, that I had never left. I stepped closer in the dream, even though I didn't want to. Something pulled me forward. A pressure behind my eyes, a gravity in my chest. The face turned toward me, not with movement that made sense, not with muscles and joints behaving the way they should. The head rotated, as if the neck was simply an idea. The eyes met mine, and then the mouth opened wider. Something dark gathered at the lips, thick and shining, and it began to spill out slowly, as if the body was draining itself. It wasn't blood. It was darker than blood, heavier, almost tar-like, and it made no sound as it slid down the chin. The liquid hit the pavement and spread, crawling like something alive. It moved with purpose, as if it knew where I was standing and wanted to reach me. I tried to back away, but my feet would not obey. I tried to scream, but my throat locked shut. The only sound I could hear was my own breathing, fast and shallow, and the soft, sticky glide of that black substance spreading across the road. It reached the toe of my shoe. The cold sensation traveled instantly up my leg like ice water injected into my veins. The darkness climbed my body with the slow certainty of a rising tide, and I felt it press against my skin, searching for openings. I woke up choking. I sat upright so hard my spine cracked. My sheets were twisted around me, damp with sweat. My mouth tasted like metal, and my heart was racing as if I had been running. I turned on my bedside lamp, and my eyes went straight to my feet. There was something on my sock, a dark smear. It looked like oil. It looked like tar, and when I touched it, it was sticky. Over the next weeks, I learned the difference between fear and dread. Fear is sharp. It spikes. It flares. It passes. Dread is slow. It settles into the body like sediment and becomes part of the blood. The nightmares returned, and each time they did, they came with a new detail that felt designed to make waking life harder. The road appeared again, but it wasn't always the same. Sometimes the trees were closer, leaning in like they were listening. Sometimes the headlights were dim, like my car was dying. Sometimes the body on the road was positioned differently, as if something had been adjusting it between my visits. Sometimes the silhouette in the trees stepped closer. I started sleeping with a towel on my pillow because I kept waking up drooling, my mouth dry and bitter. I started washing my hands obsessively because I kept feeling like something was under my fingernails. I tried to tell myself it was normal. People had nightmares after traumatic events. People saw flashes. People heard sounds. People relived moments. I clung to the phrase, people, because it implied I belonged with them. Then the evidence got harder to explain. I woke up one morning with dirt in my hair. Not a few grains. Clumps. Earth pressed into my scalp as if I had been lying on the ground. I stood in the shower scrubbing until my skin turned red, and still I kept smelling that road, that outdoor cold, that faint metallic tang. Another time, I woke with scratches on my forearm, parallel lines that looked like fingernails had dragged down my skin. The marks were not deep enough to bleed, but they burned like fresh insult. I stopped leaving my window open. I started pushing my dresser against my bedroom door at night, not because I thought someone would come in, but because it made me feel like I was doing something. My parents asked why I looked tired. Friends asked why I had become quiet. Teachers asked why my grades had slipped. I lied. I smiled. I insisted I was fine. The truth was that my nights had become a second life, and my days were the punishment for surviving them. By the time I was in my early 20s, I had learned how to function while hollow. I went to work. I paid bills. I ate food that tasted like paper. I laughed at jokes I didn't understand. I looked at myself in mirrors and tried to recognize the person staring back. The nightmares had changed shape. The road was still there, but it was no longer the only place. Now there were hallways, long, fluorescent corridors with floors that shone like they were always freshly cleaned. Doors lined the walls, evenly spaced, identical. The air smelled like antiseptic and stale fabric. Somewhere far away, something made a soft, repetitive beeping sound, like a machine keeping time. In these dreams, I walked barefoot, and the floor was cold enough to ache. My steps made no noise. The lights overhead buzzed faintly, a persistent hum that filled my skull. Sometimes I passed a window, and outside was not a sky or a parking lot, but darkness. Not nighttime darkness. A blankness, like the world beyond the glass had never been rendered. Sometimes I saw movement ahead, low to the ground. A shape crossing the hall not on two legs, but on hands and knees, quick and jittering like an insect. When I tried to follow it, the hallway stretched. The distance increased. The fluorescent lights flickered, and the buzzing grew louder until it felt like my teeth were vibrating. I started to lose pieces of time, not in a dramatic way, not blackouts, more like missing texture. I would look at the calendar and feel startled by the month. I would see photographs and feel disconnected, as if I had been present, but not inside my own body. One day I realized I couldn't remember my 20th birthday. I could remember things around it, vaguely, a cake, a room, people, but the actual memory was smeared like a thumbprint on wet ink. I tried to dismiss it. People forget. People blur. People move on. But my life started to feel like it was skipping forward in small increments, like a video with frames missing. I began to wonder if sleep was taking more than rest. I began to wonder if it was taking years. In my mid-20s, I had a nightmare that left a mark on my mind so deep it felt permanent. In the dream, I was back in the fluorescent hallway, but this time I was not alone. I could sense others behind doors, breathing, shifting weight. Small sounds that suggested people were contained on the other side of thin walls. I walked until I reached a heavy door at the end of the corridor. It wasn't like the others. It was thicker, reinforced, with a small window set high. There was no handle on my side. I stood in front of it, and the air grew colder, as if the door radiated refrigeration. My breath fogged slightly. Something appeared in the window. At first, only a forehead, then eyes, then a nose. The face pressed closer, flattening against the glass. The skin looked pale and stretched, with a sheen of sweat. The eyes moved too smoothly, tracking me as if it knew exactly where I would stand. Then the mouth opened, and black saliva slid out, thick and glossy, stringing between lips and glass like melted plastic. The face smiled. Not in a friendly way, not in a recognizable human expression. It was the kind of smile that suggested the muscles had learned the movement without understanding what it was meant to convey. The black spit dripped downward, leaving trails. I tried to step back, but the lights overhead flickered, and when they steadied, the door was no longer at the end of the hall. It was behind me. I turned, and it was right there, inches away. The window was at eye level now. The face was still pressed to the glass, smiling wider, the black fluid pooling at the bottom edge. A sound came from inside the door. Not speech. A wet, congested noise, like someone inhaling through a mouthful of liquid. Then the door shuddered, as if something had struck it from within. I woke up with my heart hammering, sheets twisted, breath ragged. I sat there shaking, waiting for the panic to pass, and then I smelled it. A sharp, chemical cleanliness, like disinfectant. It was in my room. I turned on my light and scanned the corners. Nothing moved, no shadow shifted. The room looked normal, except for the fact that the air itself seemed different, as if it had been wiped down with hospital-grade cleaner. I got out of bed and stepped onto the carpet. My bare foot stuck for a second. I looked down. There was a dark smear on the floor, glossy and thick, like something had dripped and partially dried. I stared at it, and the dread in my stomach became something heavier, because the smear looked exactly like the black saliva from the dream. It wasn't a single moment that broke me. It was accumulation, the way erosion ruins stone without ever making a sound. I stopped trusting my own senses. I stopped trusting my own memories. I began to fear waking up because I didn't know what kind of day I would be handed. Some mornings I would open my eyes and feel older, not emotionally older, but physically, as if my body had been used through the night. My joints ached. My muscles felt bruised. My mouth tasted like I had bitten my tongue. I started getting flashes during the day. I would be standing in a grocery store aisle, staring at cereal boxes, and suddenly the fluorescent lights above would buzz louder, and the hallway would appear in my mind so sharply, it overlaid reality. I would be driving, and for a fraction of a second, I would see the road from my trauma, the body in the headlights, the trees leaning in. My hands would tighten on the wheel until my fingers cramped. I began to avoid mirrors because sometimes, in the corner of my eye, my reflection didn't move exactly when I moved. I began to avoid sleep because sleep was becoming a place I could not leave. When I finally went to see someone about it, it wasn't because I had accepted I needed help. It was because I had started to suspect that if I didn't, I would not survive. The appointments blurred together in my memory. The sterile office, the soft voice, the questions that felt like traps. I tried to explain without sounding insane. I tried to translate the sensation of being hunted by my own unconscious. I was given labels. I was given routines. I was told to keep a journal. I was told to breathe. I was told to be patient. It was almost funny. My life was unraveling, and people wanted me to wait politely for it to stop. The first true break happened on a night when I tried to stay awake. I drank coffee until my hands shook. I sat in my living room with all the lights on. I watched hours of television without absorbing any of it. I scrolled my phone until the screen hurt my eyes. Eventually, exhaustion won, the way it always does. I dozed off sitting upright. And that was all it took. The hallway returned instantly, brighter than ever, buzzing with fluorescent rage. The air smelled like chemicals and sweat and damp fabric. The floor was so cold it burned. I looked down and saw restraints on my wrists. Leather straps. My hands were free enough to move, but the straps were there, buckled loosely, as if someone had just unfastened them. My throat tightened. My lungs pulled in air that tasted like metal and disinfectant. I started walking, and my bare feet left faint wet prints behind me. I did not remember stepping in water. I looked down again and realized the wetness was dark. Not red, not brown, black. It coated my soles like oil, and with every step, it left a glossy mark on the hallway floor. Something moved ahead, low and quick. The crawling shape. It skittered across the corridor, then stopped and turned its head toward me. Its movements were sharp and hungry, like an animal too long kept in a cage. Black drool hung from its mouth in thick ropes, stretching almost to the floor. Then it scuttled toward me. I tried to run, but the hallway stretched, lights flickering, the hum growing louder until it vibrated my bones. The crawling figure closed the distance anyway, impossibly fast, its hands slapping against the floor with wet sounds. I felt its breath on my ankles, cold and damp. And then it grabbed me. Its fingers were too long, nails blunt and darkened, and its grip felt like suction, like it was trying to pull something out of my skin. I woke up screaming. Not a dream scream. A real one. My voice tore out of my throat so hard it left me hoarse. Neighbors called. Someone came to check on me. There were concerned faces and questions. I managed to calm down. I managed to pretend. But when I looked down at my ankles, there were bruises forming, finger-shaped marks blooming under the skin, as if something had truly held me. The older I got, the harder it became to identify milestones. I could tell you I lived in different apartments. I could tell you I had different jobs. I could tell you I tried different medications, different methods, different promises to myself. But the years did not feel like a line anymore. They felt like a loop. Certain mornings repeated in sensation, in light, in the way my stomach sat heavy, in the way my hands trembled when I poured coffee. Certain days had a familiar texture, as if I had already lived them, forgotten them, and been forced to live them again. My nightmares grew more organized. The hallway became a facility. The doors began to have small windows. I began to see rooms beyond them. Beds bolted to the floor, thin mattresses, blankets folded with military precision. Sometimes I saw staff. Not faces, not details, just shapes and uniforms moving with calm efficiency. Their footsteps made no sound. Sometimes I saw other patients, and the sight of them turned my stomach in a way that felt primal. Their eyes were too wide. Their movements were too sudden. Some of them rocked on benches in the hallway, rocking so hard their spines looked like they might snap. Some of them sat with their heads tilted at angles that suggested they were listening to something inside the walls. More than once, I saw someone crawl across the floor, leaving black streaks behind them, their mouth hanging open and drooling the same viscous slime, as if their bodies were leaking something that should have stayed inside. I started to suspect I was not dreaming. I started to suspect I was remembering. That possibility made everything worse. Because if I was remembering, then the life I thought I was living might be the dream. And if that was true, then sleep was not the danger. Waking was. Eventually, I reached the point where the outside world could no longer keep pretending I was functional. It wasn't dramatic in the way movies make it dramatic. There were no heroic restraints, no theatrical collapse, no neat moment of surrender. There was just a slow, visible decline, the kind that makes people around you uneasy because they can't name what they're watching. I stopped showing up to work. I stopped answering calls. I stopped opening curtains. I stopped eating regularly. I lost weight. My face sharpened. My eyes sank into my skull. Sleep became unavoidable, and every time it took me, the facility waited on the other side like a familiar mouth. Then one day I woke up, and I was there. Not in a dream where I wandered through hallways. Not in a nightmare where I floated through scenes. I opened my eyes and saw a ceiling made of stained acoustic tiles. I smelled bleach and old sweat. I heard distant metal clanks and muffled cries that came and went like waves. My body felt heavy, sluggish, as if my blood had been thickened. I sat up slowly, expecting to find myself in my own bed. Instead, I found a thin mattress, a frame bolted to the floor, and a blanket that felt like paper. My heart hammered. My mouth was dry. My tongue tasted faintly of chemical bitterness. I turned my head and saw bars on the window. The glass beyond them was cloudy, making the daylight outside look like it had been diluted. The room was small and too clean in the way old buildings tried to be clean, with corners that never truly lost their grime. The walls were a pale color that suggested someone had once chosen it to feel calming, but time had tinted it into something sickly. I stood, unsteady, and walked to the door. It was heavy. It had a small window. I looked through it. The hallway outside was the same one from my nightmares, the same fluorescent stretch of cold linoleum and humming light. Except now, it wasn't distant. It wasn't distorted by dream logic. It was tangible. It was there. And the moment I realized that, I saw movement at the far end. A patient crawled into view. Their knees slid across the floor without friction, as if their skin was slick. Their fingers splayed wide, palms slapping softly against the linoleum. Their head hung low, and black saliva dripped from their mouth in thick strands, staining the floor in a dark trail. They paused, then lifted their face slightly. Their eyes were wet, shiny, too aware. Their mouth stretched open, and more black slime pooled at the lips, as if their body was producing it endlessly. They did not look at me like a person seeing another person. They looked at me like something recognizing food. More movement stirred behind them. Another patient, upright but swaying, hair clumped and greasy, eyes fixed on a point above the lights. Their jaw worked silently, chewing nothing, black drool sliding down their chin and dripping onto their chest. Further down, someone sat against the wall, rocking with violent rhythm, their head tapping the paint, leaving faint marks. Their hands moved over their own arms, rubbing as if trying to remove something invisible. The hallway smelled faintly sweet beneath the bleach, like decay hidden under disinfectant. I backed away from the door, my pulse thundering. My mind screamed at me to wake up. But I was awake. I knew I was awake because my feet hurt, because my mouth was dry, because the air was too cold, because I could feel the rough texture of the blanket under my fingers. This was the place my nightmares had been building toward. This was the end. Or so I thought. Time in the facility behaved differently. The lights never changed. The air never felt fresh. The sounds were constant, a distant chorus of murmurs, shouts, sobs, laughter that turned abruptly into choking coughs. I saw staff moving through the hall, their expressions neutral, their bodies calm in a way that made everything feel more sinister. They carried clipboards. They opened doors. They guided patients with gentle hands that felt rehearsed. Every surface looked scrubbed, but nothing felt clean. The patients drifted through the corridor like broken objects. Some walked stiffly, arms held close, heads tilted. Some crawled. Some sat for hours, staring at the same spot on the floor, black saliva pooling beneath them in small dark puddles that someone eventually wiped away without comment. Sleep came whether I wanted it or not. And when I slept there, I dreamed of my apartment. I dreamed of normal life. I dreamed of sunlight through curtains. I dreamed of a younger face in a mirror. When I woke, the facility was still there, and the dreams of normality felt thin, as if they were the real hallucination. It became harder to hold on to the idea of my outside life. Details began to slide away. Addresses blurred, phone numbers vanished. Faces of people I cared about became vague, like sketches washed in rain. I began to fear I had invented them. Then, one day, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A bulletin board in the hallway, covered in laminated papers. My eyes caught on one particular sheet. A photograph. My photograph. Not current. Not recent. Old. It showed a much younger face than the one I felt I had. The haircut was wrong. The jawline too soft. The eyes too wide with youth. The label beneath it contained my name. And beneath that, a date. a date that did not fit my timeline. The year was decades earlier than it should have been. My breath shortened. My hands went cold. My mind tried to reject it. Then the facility shifted around me in a subtle way, not physically, but in the way perception realigns when it finally accepts a truth it has been denying. The staff's faces looked older than I remembered. The building's wear looked deeper. The smells seemed more layered, more long-term. The patients' voices sounded like they had been echoing through these halls for years and years. I stumbled back to my room, heart racing, and found my reflection in the small metal mirror above the sink. For a second, it looked like it always had. Then my eyes focused, and my stomach dropped through the floor. The face staring back was not the face of a man in his early 30s. The skin was thinner, the cheeks hollow, the eyes sunk deeper into their sockets. The hair was sparse and gray at the edges. The mouth held the slight downward pull of age, the kind that comes from decades of gravity and pain. I blinked hard, as if clearing tears. The face did not become younger, it stayed. And in that moment, the final horror arrived. Quiet and absolute. Memory hit me like a flood. Not a neat recollection, not a tidy montage. A crushing weight of realization. The road, the body, the silhouette in the trees. That night I was 18 had not been the beginning of a long life plagued by nightmares. It had been the end. I had not built a normal adulthood and then fallen apart later. I had fallen apart immediately, and everything afterward had been my mind attempting to build a world where I could keep moving forward, even while my body stayed trapped in a place designed to contain what I became. The hallucinated decades suddenly made sense, not as a coherent story, but as a desperate patchwork. Jobs that never existed, apartments I never rented, streets I never walked, years I never lived, all of it created by a brain trying to protect itself from the truth that it had been locked away since the moment it broke. I understood, in a sick, crystal clarity, that the fluorescent hallway had never been a nightmare location invented by my subconscious. It had been my environment. The reason it returned so often was because it was the one place my mind could never fully escape. The black slime, the drooling, the crawling patients, the staff moving with calm control, all of it had been there the entire time, bleeding into my dreams like sewage rising through a cracked floor. I looked at my hands, and they were spotted with age. The veins stood out. The skin had the translucent fragility of an elderly body. 75. That number felt impossible. It felt like a cruel joke. And yet my reflection confirmed it. The worst part was not realizing I had been inside for decades. The worst part was realizing I could not remember the real versions of those decades at all. I could not remember holidays. I could not remember summers. I could not remember the feeling of being outside without bars on the window, because I had not been outside. My mind had spent 57 years building a fictional life to survive the unbearable reality of confinement. And the patients in the hallway, the ones who crawled and drooled black slime, the ones whose eyes tracked like hungry animals, the ones who rocked until their bones looked strained, they suddenly looked different to me. They looked less like monsters. They looked like future versions of me, what happens when a person is left long enough in a place where time stops being a human thing. I backed away from the mirror, and my legs shook. A sound echoed down the hallway, wet and congested, like someone struggling to breathe around fluid. I looked through my door window again. The crawling patient was closer now. Their trail of black saliva glistened under the fluorescent lights. They moved with purpose. They moved like they had been waiting a long time for me to finally remember where I was. I stood there staring through the glass, and something settled into my bones. It wasn't peace. It wasn't acceptance. It was the understanding that the mind can only run for so long before it collapses from exhaustion, and when it does, reality is still there, patient and unchanging. My entire imagined life had been a long sprint away from one moment, one traumatic fracture at 18. Now the sprint was over. Now there was only the hallway, only the smell of bleach trying to mask rot, only the hum of lights that never turned off, only the slow approach of people who had been broken for longer than I had been pretending. The crawling patient reached my door and pressed their face up to the window, flattening their features against the glass. Black slime coated their lips. Their eyes rolled slightly, as if they were trying to focus through decades of damage. They opened their mouth, and more of that viscous black substance poured out, sliding down the window in thick ropes. It pooled at the bottom edge and began to seep beneath the door, thin tendrils creeping across the floor like something alive. I stepped back instinctively, and my heel caught on the bed frame. My heart slammed against my ribs. I felt the cold of the creeping blackness reach my bare foot. The sensation wasn't pain at first. It was familiarity. A memory of a road at 18. A memory of tar crawling toward my shoe. A memory of waking up with it on my sock, sticky and undeniable. It had never been a dream. It had always been here. And as the blackness climbed, as it spread across the floor of my small room and reached for me like a patient hand, I understood the final cruelty of it all. The nightmares were not a warning of what might happen. They were a reminder of what already had. I had spent my whole life sleeping to escape, and I had spent my whole life waking up in the same place.